Good evening and welcome, everybody. I'm Professor Steve Cohen, Senior Vice Dean here at Columbia's School of Professional Studies and the Director of the Masters of Science in Sustainability Management program. Welcome to the first in our Frame Your Future event series. This is the first of 6 multidisciplinary programs taking place over the next month. In each event, we'll look at a timely and important question from the perspective of 2 or more of the master's programs taught here at Columbia's School of Professional Studies. Tonight, we bring together faculty and alums from sustainability management, sustainability science, and the construction administration degree programs to discuss influential and emerging science, policy, and practices that are poised to facilitate more sustainable and livable built environments and municipalities. As the author of a book called The Sustainable City, this topic is of particular interest to me. At the end of the panel discussion, we'll have a Q&A session to provide you with the opportunity to ask questions to the panel. Also, keep an eye on the chat as there are representatives from the master's programs ready to engage with you on the content raised in tonight's conversation. I want to thank my fellow program directors for their collaboration on these events, as well as the School of Professional Studies media and events team, who do a great job in everything that they do. And now I'll introduce our guest moderator, Allison Snyder. Allison graduated from MIT with a degree in chemical engineering and studied botany at the University of Canterbury in New Zealand on a Fulbright scholarship. She's written for the Washington Post, Scientific American, and the Lancet. She's a managing editor at Axios, where she covers science, space, and transportation. Thanks for being here tonight, Allison, and please take it away.
Thank you, Steve, and welcome everyone who's joining us. Good evening to everyone. We're going to spend the next 45 minutes or so tracing a path from some of the most promising research and applied science in renewable energy to policy and planning at the federal and local levels, and measures for consumers and commercial developers to help make the built environment cleaner and more sustainable. Our panel brings together industry leaders, faculty, and alumni representatives from Columbia University and the School of Professional Studies. So I'm going to quickly introduce everyone. David Goldberg is a professor of marine geology and geophysics at Lamont-Doherty Earth Observatory and associate director of Columbia's Earth Institute. He's also a lecturer in sustainability science at the School of Professional Studies. Sean Hoyt is an alumni of the Sustainability Management Program at SPS and a program manager at Con Edison. Francisco Pineda is program director for the Master of Science in Construction Administration at SPS. He has worked on all aspects of the development cycle, investment, development, and construction, and he serves on multiple committees as a senior advisor. And Carolyn Carinante is a lecturer in the MS program in Construction Administration in the School of Professional Studies and a project manager at Tishman Construction. So welcome to all of you. Thank you so much for taking the time to do this. As Steve mentioned, we're going to take some questions from the audience at the end. So please have your questions ready and you can drop them into the chat and we'll get to them. So I just wanted to start by asking each of you to set a little bit of context for your work. You know, climate change can feel, I guess, like distant and abstract most of the time, and for a lot of people, and yet we know this is a mounting crisis. So my question is, how do each of you see this every day? I mean, how is it manifest in your day-to-day? And maybe I'll start with David.
Sure. So thanks, Allison. Thanks, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here. So my research basically focuses on climate mitigation solutions. I'm looking to try to put a bit of the problem away for good, and looking at ways of doing that. My research has been a fairly focused thing over the last couple of decades on what we can do with a lot of carbon dioxide if we're able to remove it from the atmosphere or capture it from before it gets into the atmosphere, and where can you put it away. So it is very much in my day-to-day thinking. My research is got a few specific topics. I'm sure we'll cover it, particularly toward looking at the oceans as part of the solution. but it is very much my focus point for most of my research these days.
I want to come back to you and talk about some of the work you're doing, 'cause it's really fascinating. But I wanted to just bring everybody else in too. Francisco, maybe could you talk a little bit about how you see this manifest in the day-to-day work that you do?
Thank you, Allison and David and everybody else for having us here. I think that both the event we're having tonight and the type of work that we do at Columbia and across other academies links much of what is needed in terms of deploying some of these ideas, developing these ideas, and integrating them. We see it from sort of cradle to grave. Students that are in their mid-careers thinking about what impact they want to make, both in their lives, to their communities, coming to look for new opportunities to develop and to exchange ideas themselves. And then how that then translates into the market and into organizations that are taking part of this. Some of them the solution, others sort of perpetuating the problems. And we're in a really interesting juncture in those personal journeys and life journeys.
How about you, Carolyn?
Well, thank you also for having me. My work kind of centers on implementing some of the sustainable practices that are out there right now. From a design point of view, I have the architectural background and some of the knowledge on previous projects on how to implement sustainable assets and aspects of the job into construction, and how we manage that, how we manage the expectation on a small level and also on a macro level just for the world, and how we set an example for future projects to also implement these types of designs. So it's really more from a construction point of view that I get involved with the sustainability aspect.
And Sean, how about you and your work with Con Ed?
Yep, pleasure to be here tonight. Thank you all for having me. I'm kind of where the rubber meets the road, working for the utility company in New York City, really providing solutions for our customers and trying to help them on the traditional side and on the clean energy side. I started my career in the field at Con Edison, working on the traditional infrastructure, which would be behind the meter, or in front of the meter rather. Now I'm working with customers more to help them reduce their energy by means of customer side solutions. So really developing those models. It may not initially translate into sustainability for the customers, but creating the business model to help them adopt some energy efficiency technologies to help reduce carbon emissions.
Got it. Okay, we're going to dig into what everybody does in a second. I want to start with David. You're a geophysicist. You alluded to this, among other things, you're turning carbon dioxide into stone, and you want to do this in the ocean. And I'm hoping you can talk about how this works and why it matters.
Well, sure. There's a lot to unpack there. Maybe we'll start at the end. Why it matters, and I think the volumes. It speaks volumes to talk about the volumes. We globally emit a lot of CO2. In a lot of different industrial sectors. Something on closing in on 40 billion tons a year. Not quite yet, but we're getting close to that number. And that is an unsustainable situation. The climate is warming because of it, and we're looking to capture some of that CO2 and put it away. And so one of the technologies that I've been focused on is something called carbon capture and storage. And that in and of itself is self-explanatory. We're capturing carbon from a variety of different sources, whether it's an industrial a power plant, which is one of the major emitters, or from a industrial manufacturing facility, for example, a steel plant or something like that. These are major sources of CO2. They need to be, that CO2 needs to be captured, condensed, and put away. And the typical way that's done is geologically. In other words, it's injected in geological formations where it can be safely and securely stored for a long, long time. That's relatively known technology. We've been doing this collectively for decades around the globe with the purpose, for a lot of different purposes, and more recently for the purpose of putting the carbon away. It's technology that exists. We just need to have motivation and be able to scale it at to very large numbers. So all of that technology in the globe puts away about 40 million tons annually. and we're looking at a 40 billion ton problem. So you can see the size of the problem, and that led me looking at the world to look for a good place to do that. And the oceans are, I think, a big part of the potential answer. It's for a variety of reasons. One is there's a lot of space. There's a lot of relevant geology there, particularly the geology you mentioned that might turn that carbon dioxide into a solid form, from carbon dioxide into carbonate, like limestone. And that's the chemistry that happens in the sub-ocean, or can happen in the sub-ocean. And most importantly, that technology is, or the ocean technology is away from people and their things. So we can do this safely and securely at large scale, which is really the key motivator here.
And what's holding it back now?
Say it again?
What's holding it back now? What's the
Well, I mean, doing anything in the ocean is a little more expensive than doing it on land. So that's number one. But in general, it's a pricing issue, regardless of where it is. This exercise is not a zero-sum game in terms of collecting the carbon and storing it. The big cost in doing so is the collection of CO2, depending on where you get it from. It costs different amounts, but it's not free. And doing so in a commercially viable and efficient manner has been a challenge to date. There are some incentives, particularly in the U.S., that are now moving in the right direction. CO2 credits, tax credits, are approaching $50 a ton for certain kinds of storage. So that's a good thing. That we're moving towards a value where it will incentivize businesses and operators of facilities to capture CO2 and put it away. So that's number one hurdle.
I want to talk about hurdles of a slightly different kind with Sean, and that's you manage a customer-facing sort of program at Con Edison. Can you tell us a little bit about it, and I guess sort of the types of small businesses in New York that you work with, and how they aren't being incentivized to make some of these adjustments?
Yeah, sure. So I'm the program manager for the small to medium business program at Con Edison, and we provide incentives for all customer types, all market segments, from bodegas to coffee shops to fitness centers to office spaces, you name it. We like to look at them as the foundation of New York City's economy, and really helping them afford measures such as HVAC upgrades, traditional lighting, all the low-hanging fruit, refrigeration if you are in a supermarket. And then on the gas side, we also have gas incentives. And what we really do is, for this program, we make a completely turnkey solution where the customers that may not have the time, knowledge, expertise, or wherewithal to seek out these incentives, we provide it to them complete from a free energy assessment at the beginning, all the way through to installation if the customer chooses to move through with the project. On average, we incentivize about 50% of the total project costs, right? And, because of COVID, we kind of structured it to increase those incentives to help the customers that need it the most. Our role in energy efficiency isn't only geared towards small to medium businesses, though. We have incentives for residential customers, that's 1 to 4 family units. We have incentives for multifamily, that's the larger commercial buildings, 5 units and above. And then we have large and commercial industrial incentives as well. So we have a variety of ways that we help. And to David's point, removing carbon from the atmosphere is important, especially in some of these industries, in steel, in cement, and in agriculture perhaps as well. But what we try to do is reduce the amount of carbon dioxide that's emitted into the atmosphere by reducing it on the customer side of the value chain, essentially, right? On average, 1 kilowatt hour produces a little bit over 1 pound of carbon dioxide. Now, since these programs that we've been managing at Con Edison have been in place since 2009, more than 1 million customers have upgraded to energy efficiency equipment, saving more than 7 million metric tons of carbon emissions, right? And our energy efficiency goals are only getting larger. So that really helps David with his carbon capture, because he's going to have to capture less.
Are you seeing a shift in receptiveness in this kind of clean energy programs as you go about your job?
I mean, it's kind of a mixed bag. As more customers become aware of it and understand the monetary gain and value, the more participate. Now, we do have a regulatory construct. We're a regulated utility. We report up to the New York State Public Service Commission, and a lot of these mandates and regulatory reform policies kind of help us gear our programs towards alignment with the New York State clean energy goals. And it kind of trickles down to our customers, right? Customers are also faced with regulatory mandates at the city and the state level that they have to become in compliance with to meet basic code requirements. So we kind of just help ease the burden on our customers. A lot of the calculations behind the scenes may be complex, and we really try to simplify the process, help our customers come in at or under budget, and then add no delays to their project timeline, which is important, especially for large commercial customers looking to get in capital projects before the year end. So we are seeing an uptick as we become more well-versed, as we onboard more contractors and vendors that are experts in this area, and as our incentives start to roll in and we really see what we could achieve in this space.
You set Francisco up perfectly with the word regulatory, but I have to ask you before we go there. I want to ask you about what made you decide to you graduated from this program, from the SPS program. I'm curious what made you decide to go back for your master's, and what did you look for then versus, I guess, what would you look for now, or what do you look for in the people that you would hire to do the same similar work to what you're doing?
It's a good question. I began my career, as I mentioned, in the field. I was a general utility worker, so working all throughout the distribution system as an electrician, working on capital projects, building substations, working in power gen stations and in emergency storm efforts such as Hurricane Sandy. I was part of the restoration projects for the company during that time. About 7 years into that role, just started understanding and wanting a better understanding of how the system works from a macro level, how we feed into the state legislation and policies across the nation. And I kind of stumbled across the sustainability management program. I was looking for construction administration programs, almost applied to one, and kind of just pivoted towards the clean energy practices. I wanted to have a different sort of impact professionally. Quick story, if I used to go out to social functions, you say you work for Con Edison, the first question anyone asks you is, can you save me money? Right. So I was kind of reluctant. I mean, I know the work that I was doing was important, but I was reluctant to say where I worked because, I pay a Con Ed bill the same way my neighbor pays a Con Ed bill. There's no discounts in that way. But now, since coming over and shifting towards the clean energy side where I actually have incentives, I'm happy when people ask me, where do you work? I say Con Edison. And when that question comes, can you help me save money? I give them a laundry list of solutions and ways that they can. Right. So it's really just, the sustainability management program really taught me how to build a business case, because not everybody cares about the environment. Unfortunately, not everybody believes in climate change. Not everybody cares about sustainability, but they care about reducing their price or their cost. Right. So you kind of have to disguise it in a way that makes sense to them. And then the byproduct is good for the environment.
Thank you. So Francisco, I wanted to ask you, you were on the Biden transition team advising them on infrastructure, the infrastructure plan. Can you talk about what's in that plan and sort of what its implications are, particularly in the context of what we're talking about with Sean?
Sure. Thank you, Allison. I was on the Biden Infrastructure Policy Committee that led up to the election, and then we handed over to the transition team. But we shaped much of the platform that he ended up running on, and then informed sort of the final, the final pillars of it. I've been very excited by it for three reasons. The U.S. never really had an infrastructure strategy. Or at least not since the 1930s and 40s and some of the post-war industrial strategy. This is the first time we have something that resembles one. The UK just came out with theirs. It's an exciting one. It's been criticized for not being detailed enough, but I think a strategy is not meant to be detailed. It's meant to give us some guiding principles. Theirs is to stimulate jobs. It's to become net zero carbon emitter by 2050, and to support both the role of public and private investments and define the role of both of those. I think the infrastructure platform that Biden, at the Biden-Harris administration, has put together gets very close to that. What is exciting about it is that it's essentially focused on three pockets, about 8 pillars, but 3 main pockets or main themes. One is we need to modernize our infrastructure. It is over 100 years old. It is decrepit. I have been very critical of the idea of continuing sort of down these wrong paths. And I think finally we're challenging the notion that we need to just repair and replace. We need to rethink. Some of it could be micro infrastructure as well as impermanent infrastructure like the ferry system in New York and so many other really interesting ideas. The second main theme is that we are in a recessionary environment. There's plenty of great data and scholarship that supports the economic impact that infrastructure has on the national, state, and local levels. You know, that multiplier is anywhere from 1.5 to 3x, depending on where we are in the cycle. So this is also really about putting cheap debt and using debt to essentially modernize the United States infrastructure. And the third piece of this is a focus on investments in clean energy, renewable energy, and to the work that David does that is really critical is R&D in new technologies. That doesn't happen. David highlighted how expensive it is to really do this, and to do this at scale at a commercial level requires underwriting, and this plan has a significant focus on that. If we even look at federal spending on R&D in the last 10 years, it went down from about 170 billion to about 120 billion, and that's a significant loss in critical investments at that early stage of innovation across any technology. So those are some of the exciting parts of this. I think there's going to be challenges, mainly that our system of government is not really centrally planned or deployed. Infrastructure really is the domain of the state. 75% of infrastructure is both planned, funded, and executed at the state. There's a logic and sense to that, but it does sort of disconnect the broader idea and broader federal funds to local politics and local needs. So, but I think we're getting close to that. Cuomo's plan does somehow mirror the federal government's plan, which includes 29 billion in green energy, as well as 20 billion in affordable housing, and the rest in general infrastructure spend. So I hope that sort of provides a rough layout of what we hope is going to come down the pipeline Q4, Q1 2022.
So Carolyn sort of works at where these guidelines and standardization sort of rubber hits the road. You work on these huge commercial real estate projects. Can you talk, I guess, a little bit about how much of your time is spent thinking about or following or trying to figure out the guidelines for sustainability and how that's changing over time?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, it kind of hits on the points that everybody has mentioned. I think Fran mentioned modernizing, Sean mentioned incentivizing. I think Dave mentioned new technologies. And when you think about the actual construction of a building, it really boils down to what are owners willing to spend and how do we implement that? And then it boils down to the level of contractors, what can we offer? So with the changing world of sustainability and bringing that into construction, there's, I see it on a daily basis. There's a raised awareness for where we can save energy, where we can recycle content, use recycled content. From the design point of view, try to encourage using local resources as opposed to outsourcing a lot of work. And similarly, like on some of our jobs in New York City, we started seeing a major shift and change in some of the ways that we conserve energy. For example, down in Midtown on 561 Greenwich, they're using a geothermal system to transfer heat into the building. Now, there might be a sort of a long lead time before you get to the point of seeing the output there. But from a standpoint of conserving, it's an excellent method that people are starting to implement. And maybe 10, 15 years ago, it really wasn't even viable, because it could have been like an expensive proposition. But now you're starting to see that a lot. And I also want to mention with LEED, everybody is starting to use that. That's almost like a norm now in all of our projects. So we do implement LEED or the WELL program. It's just a standard now to start to use these standards that 10, 15 years ago were not required. And now it's part of our strategy. So on a daily basis, I'm seeing the need to raise awareness for sustainability, and also bring to the forefront from a construction point of view at AECOM Tishman how we can offer that solution for owners and for government funded projects.
What does a building, I guess, that uses geothermal energy look like? How is it different in a noticeable way to those of us who walk into it, or to those at the back end of it?
It's more on the back end of it. I would say for this building particularly, they're drilling 120-foot piles down into the ground, and they're coiling all the coils to capture the energy. And then you would see the savings over time, but you're basically transferring your heat load into the building, so that about 50% of the building's heating and cooling is coming from a natural resource like that. And if you ever needed to heat or cool your building after, more than what you're getting from the geothermal system, which is a cost savings, it's very little. So it's a lot less expensive in the long run, and it's better for the environment in the long run. That's another point with sustainability, is where do you see the cost savings, and what does that analysis look like over time? For a lot of these technologies, and I'm sure that probably Dave could reiterate, you don't see them for a little while, but when you do see them, it's worth it. And even from a homeowner's point of view, photovoltaic cells, a couple of years ago, nobody would have had them on their roof. Now you see your neighbors with them, you see everybody down the block with them. It's almost like you kind of know the benefit just by word of mouth, raising awareness, and people seeing them a little more often.
Yeah, so you just actually answered a question from Audrey in the audience about the sort of comparing the cost between energy efficient and environmental buildings and compared to a normal building. But it sounds like you're saying the cost is upfront and obviously is seen over years.
Yeah.
Dave, can I ask you, is geothermal another potentially viable energy source at scale? What are the kinds of challenges in using that type of energy?
Right. So Carolyn put forth this idea of using geothermal for heat, and my personal view is that is where it is really going to be valuable. You don't have to go very deep. 100, well, as a geologist, 100, 300 feet is not very deep. So you don't have to go much deeper than that to get to a fairly stable temperature. And if you can recycle the fluid, the water that's at that depth, it'll cool in the summer when it's 70, 80 degrees in the building, and it'll heat in the winter, at least getting you most of the way there towards, say, 65 or whatever your preferred heat is. So what you need to supplement outside of that that geothermal heating system is much less. So it is a terrific way to reduce operating costs. What it also requires, though, is some capital investment up front. So just the way solar panels cost something up front to put on the roof, geothermal wells and the plumbing that goes with it cost something to put in the ground when you're building your building or retrofitting your building. It's probably less expensive to put it in at the beginning than it is to retrofit. But those are investments that do pay off over time. And if that can scale to many, many, many buildings, then there's both financial benefit, the break even comes later, and we start to see a large scale rollout and a reduction of energy. So that's the way I think it would scale. I mean, you can produce energy with geothermal at much higher temperatures by moving turbines and generating electricity. That you can't do everywhere. You do need higher thermal gradients, and there are specific places around the globe that do that. One of the most important ones, at least in my field, is one in Iceland, where there's the entire city of Reykjavik is basically heated and electrified using geothermal energy, just on a plant, one or two plants, I believe, outside of the city. And they have a terrific value in very, very inexpensive electricity because it's all natural, very, very low carbon production. And they also, because of that, are able to do one of the two experiments that have demonstrated this idea of turning their carbon dioxide into stone. They capture the CO2, the natural CO2 that is emitted with the steam from the geothermal plant. This is a high temperature geothermal plant, relatively speaking, not the one out back here in New York City. But they capture that CO2 and they re-inject it basically from where it came, back into the rocks below Iceland, which is lava, cooled lava. And that's the process which converts it in that location, converts it into stone. So that is a landmark, a watershed moment for this particular technology, where we can capture CO2, produce geothermal renewable energy, and store it permanent, and store what CO2 is emitted back in the ground permanently. So that is a fantastic experiment that we are very thankful that they have taken the initiative to conduct, and it is leading us toward new options or elsewhere around the globe that are very, very, very similar. So that's that's a synopsis of that particular experiment and that particular technology, but it is about energy. I really think we need to move towards renewable energy. We can use that energy. That's the most important thing to do. Replace fossil energy with renewable energies, whether it's geothermal, wind, solar. And then we can talk about what to do with that energy to actually capture the CCS, capture carbon and do CCS. That is a bridge. That's not the solution. It's a bridge to get us to renewables.
Sean, can you talk a little bit about, is Con Edison, how they're using renewables or plan to use renewables?
Well, yeah, sure. But on the topic of heat pumps and ground source heat pumps, which is geothermal, we did just launch a clean heat program within New York State. I know we spoke about R&D. So in New York State, we have NYSERDA, which is the New York State Energy Research and Development Authority. And they combined with the joint utilities, including Con Edison, we've launched what's called a clean heat program that incentivizes all heat pump technologies, from, again, the ground source heat pumps to heat pump body heaters, just general mini splits, air source heat pumps, etc. And I mean, these technologies are 1.5 to 4 times more efficient than your conventional boiler, right? So we're looking to electrify the system. We have lofty goals to hit under our New York new efficiency New York order. And, we're going to really push the envelope here. I hope that your Tishman client has received some incentives from our program. If not, we'll have to talk after this event to make sure that happens. But we're really looking to push the envelope. In terms of renewables, I mean, we did get awarded a storage order, which is going to help us store some of the renewables that are coming onto our system and deploy them during peak and critical times. At Con Edison, we're not allowed to own generation, right? But our customers can. We're more of the distribution system providers for our service territory. But we do have clean energy businesses that we have a lot of solar across the nation. I think across 19 states. I think we're the second largest solar providers in the United States of America under that umbrella, right? So we do have our foot in the door in terms of renewable, and we're making sure that we can provide infrastructure upgrades to accept these applications when customers want to do what's called net metering and feed the grid and receive monetary value and act as a grid asset, actually, for our system.
I want to pick up on a question from Molly Wagner in the audience, who was asking about repercussions of some of the carbon capture technology. And I guess I'm going to take the liberty of asking about repercussions for or potential unintended consequences of renewable energy in general. Are they known? What are some of the thoughts? Carolyn, you're shaking your head, so I'll go to you first.
Yeah, it just brought up a thought that, it's not all, I guess it's not all accepted everywhere, because from a construction point of view, and from a competition's point of view, we tend to work with New York union contractors. And some of these energies and technologies require a specialized type of expertise that not all contractors are willing to bid on. So from that perspective, you sometimes don't get all the competitive bids that you would like to. And there's pros and cons to that, because on one end, you do raise awareness for contractors to start adapting to these new technologies and offering them. But on the other hand, right now, we're sort of limited with who we can use and who we can do the project with if they're not offering that specific type of expertise.
And David, are there bigger physical or scientific repercussions of carbon capture, unintended consequences?
So I think you're probably referring to the questioner is probably referring to the issue of safety. How secure is that CO2 if it's geologically stored? I think that's a typical question anyway. So I'll answer that one. If that's not right, we can come back to it. But yes, I think the idea of putting CO2 geologically away geologically is a very well-known, established, and well-monitored technology, and that's where it's been done on land. What's being considered now is doing this offshore offers a whole set of additional safeguards. If in fact there was some unintentional small leakage, there is, for example, an entire ocean there in which the CO2 would dissolve and have a essentially negligible effect on the vast ocean. And it does ultimately pick up the ocean, that is, pick up half the CO2 that's being emitted in the atmosphere. It's in equilibrium. So it's a very secure, well-known, relatively well-known system just to store it, and increasingly secure to store it in the oceans. And thirdly, by converting it in this process, is the natural process of converting it in from CO2 into rock. That's just an acceleration of the natural process. So then it's immobile as well. So I think the risks and the perception of those risks are real. That needs to be studied and monitored, and that's a lot of the work that's going into this, is exactly in that area. But in practice, that's not one of the unintended consequences I'm most concerned about. It's the difficult pieces are on the capture side, on the regulation and monitoring side, and transport, to be honest with you. So those are the harder pieces of the puzzle to solve.
Got it. Francisco, I was hoping we could think about 5 years out. I'm curious, I guess, sort of what your expectations are for the creation of these sort of more sustainable, less carbon dioxide producing municipalities, and how much that disconnect that you talked about between the federal and state and local regulators will impact that.
I'm not hopeful at all, Allison. In fact, I think we're going to see very little progress, and I don't think it's a clear answer. We haven't seen progress. For one thing, GHG emissions have pretty much stayed the same in the last 10 years. The only shift has been from in electricity, and that's mainly coal to gas. Natural gas has its own emissions and particulate issues, as well as third order effects that incentivize commercial fracking and others. So when we've only been out of the Paris Accord, for a few years during the Trump administration, and we were in it before then, and yet we haven't seen progress on one level. On the other level, a lot of the solutions that are being lauded at the city, at that unit of analysis level or the metro level, they're pretty much being driven by public sector companies, and most of them tech companies, which I just don't believe wholeheartedly have what's the best intentions behind this. So this idea of smart cities and monitoring, I think we're starting to put some semblance on it, but there's no organized effort in tying this together. Yes, there's some great tech out there, satellite imagery. We're getting great data to understand warming and the impact of green roofs on city environments and wellness. So things are beginning to kind of get cobbled up together in a sensible narrative. But the other end of this is we have a country where 20% of the population, or whatever number that is today, I don't remember, does not believe in climate change, are actively obstructing policy legislation, using NEPA and other forms of NIMBYism to obstruct development on this front. And then we have a large portion of the population that doesn't really care one way or another. So I think 5 years is a very small window to look at. I think 10 might also be too small. I am hopeful. I'm very optimistic that over the next 20 or 30 years, much like the UK plan and some of the European plans, including the Chinese now have their own plan, we might finally see some progress. And I think it's going to require a big cultural change in many countries, ours in specific, education and commercialization, but really just an integrated solution that ties this whole thing together, not just have folks running around in different parts and cobbling this up.
There's a question from Margot in the audience about, I guess for the citizens who do care, how can they most effectively urge their local governments to incentivize and enforce sustainability measures for local businesses? maybe, I don't know if Sean or Francisco, you want to take that one?
So the work that Con Ed and Sean is doing is one part of it. I would say, vote and make this, part of the narrative, make this part of how we're, educating the next generation and our kids and others, but also vote with your wallet. I think getting involved at the local level. Look, we're a very powerful economy in the United States, New York. And I think this is the beauty about this fragmented hyper-local system of our government, is that we can, we sort of punch well above our weight level. And I think that at least from that standpoint, we can at least set standards. California is a great example of a state that sets national standards because it's a big market. And if they put together legislation or regulation that requires X, Y, and Z, manufacturers are not going to create two products, one for California, one for the rest of the country. I think New York has done that. I think has shown some leadership. I think we need a little bit more integrated leadership. And I think that we can do both as consumers, as citizens, and as voters.
I have one more question from the audience. This is from Jeffrey, who's preparing for Columbia's sport management program. He says, it seems to me there remain rich opportunities to introduce the practices you all are discussing in this arena and sports faculties, especially at New York City venues. Sane or crazy, he asks.
I think it's totally sane. Definitely. I would say, adding to Fran's point, leading by example is so important. Sports arenas and offices and public places are the main places where you would see the most unsustainable usage even on a personal level. Think about it. When you go into your office, we're so acclimated to just taking a paper cup every time we go and grab a glass of water. It's just that mindset of knowing that, you're utilizing something that took a long time to make. If that on a personal level can be improved, then who knows what we can do by the time we get to stadiums. Maybe there is some opportunity to implement sustainable ideas that are much less wasteful. I mean, I think if there were just even some kind of analysis done on how much we waste just on one game or one event, one concert, I think that there's a lot of opportunity, maybe even more on that kind of level, because some of them are privately owned, to do something about it, as opposed to waiting for the government or waiting for society to change. Maybe it just has to happen on that level.
And if I could just add to that, I agree with Caroline completely. And you're definitely saying, when I was a student in Columbia, I was on the student board, and we organized what was called a symposium. And, we're organizing different thematic topics. And one thing that was missing was sports. So I did some research, and I found a man by the name of Alan Hershkowitz. And at the time, he was figuring out how to make NASCAR more sustainable. NASCAR, I think, is one of the biggest emitters of carbon emissions in all of sports in the world. And he figured out a due process, and he really spoke to us about that journey and what it was. I believe now he works for the New York Yankees in making that facility more sustainable through lighting, recycling, and other parts of what it takes to manage that facility. When you think about venues, they're kind of like small cities within a city, where people come, they kind of wreak havoc on the wherever they are, right? Spend a lot of money, which is good for the economy, but then they leave that mess behind. So I think it is a fundamental area that we need to focus on moving forward.
Great. I have one last question for all of you, which is that, a lot of people talk about in the context of the pandemic that this offers a reset for some of the things we're talking about, particularly and just for addressing climate change writ large. Do you share that view? And I guess what would be the most urgent or pressing priority? And maybe I'll start with Francisco.
I think I think we're on the right path, and I think certain pockets are really advancing both the technology. Again, we have to focus on basic research, the type of work that David and others are doing, and also in just surfacing this, making this part of our ethic, making this part of our everyday decision-making process, supporting those that are, and I remember when I was in Europe 35 years ago as a kid, they were already separating garbage, and I was living in California and we weren't doing that. Mm-hmm. So I think that I think those are probably one of the most important ways to get engaged and to start changing this sort of ethic around it.
Mm-hmm. David, what about you? What do you think?
Well, there has been some research about the impact of the pandemic itself on emissions and on the climate reaction. And so I'm not 100% up to date on that, but my understanding is that there are certain aspects that the emissions have reduced and others that really has not. For example, the kind of things that we're not doing anymore, like long-haul plane flights, which is a major contribution of the non-stationary sources of CO2 in the atmosphere, large volumes and very, very hard to eliminate kind of carbon. It's not going to be easy to replace jet fuel. So those kinds of things became apparent during the pandemic, that was a big dip, but I don't know. It's hard to say at this point. The jury's still out, I guess, whether that will be a persisting result after the pandemic, and whether we'll pick up our long haul flights or not. I mean, I just assume do a Zoom call or the equivalent. So, but there's a lot of people and a lot of activities that need face-to-face interaction. So a lot of travel, especially long haul flights, are a big open question. I don't know quite how that will play out. Mm-hmm. Along those lines, though, and I don't want to digress too far back, but Francisco made a point about state activity driving policy, and I think that is really important to highlight. There's a policy in California called the Low Carbon Fuel Standard, which has basically created a market for low carbon fuels by its very nature. That has driven up prices quite high to close to $200 per ton of CO2, or CO2 avoided, if you will. And that has allowed for the kinds of technologies to be developed that will do things that are so advanced, or becoming so advanced, to remove CO2 from the atmosphere, from scrub it from the air and turn it into fuel. Now, that's not a zero-sum game yet. It's, your CO2 is coming out of the atmosphere, becoming fuel, going back into the atmosphere. But the technologies are being developed with that technology, with that economic model, and that will allow ultimately for the kinds of solutions that we need to be able to scale up. So I do completely agree that state level policy can really drive these, certainly drive the technologies and drive individual action. And most importantly, at least in the work that I'm involved with, drive industrial action. This is really an industrial process where we're talking about changing.
Great. Carolyn, can I ask you how you feel like has this crisis, I guess, provided an opportunity for a reset in the types of companies and projects that you work on?
Yes, definitely. I think the pandemic for everybody really pushed everyone to take a moment to really reflect and understand where we are, place and time. This is a moment in history that, if God willing, will never repeat itself. But, for projects, a lot of projects went on hold and a lot of projects didn't. I think it really forced everybody to stop and think, how do we manage in a time where certain freedoms that we had are now not so accessible anymore, and how are we thankful for those types of things? For instance, in the context of sustainability, the same thing, transportation. I think Dave mentioned there were studies that within the first 2 months of the pandemic, like there were all types of different fish that they found in the oceans, and the air was so much purer and cleaner in certain areas. That's just a testament to how us consuming all these things that we take for granted, transportation and even foods, things like that. I think that people are starting to be more aware now of their actions. And I also think the pandemic kind of forced people that are from the suburbs to maybe do more walking, be more outdoors. Like you can walk to the grocery store, you don't have to take your car to the grocery store. And having done that for almost a year now, I think people are starting to get used to a different movement of life. And it kind of forced us New Yorkers to kind of slow down a little bit and understand that and not take those things for granted.
Great. And then the final word to Sean, you hinted at this, I think in your first remarks, are you seeing this as an opportunity and in working with local businesses for them to sort of look at ways in which they could change their practices.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, there are some businesses that benefited from the pandemic. Think about manufacturing plants and warehouses. The ones that weren't so lucky, you know, they're looking for a strategy to re-enter the market and to really have their patrons or their customers be comfortable. So now we're looking at new technologies that maybe weren't as attractive before, but are more so now, like UVC lighting for HVAC equipment, where it kind of works as a sterilization system for the duct system, which, you know, a patron would be interested in because of the potential that it clears up some of the COVID if it is in a facility. Right. So we're able to push that agenda a little bit more and really educate customers as they don't, our customers, meaning our business owners at Con Edison, about how they use their energy. I mean, I can't relay the message more. I think Francisco mentions research, right? Technology advancements. The one thing that we can't overlook is as we embark on this fourth industrial revolution of IoT, AI, and using smart automation technologies, we can't make the same mistakes that we made in the first three industrial revolutions, where now we're in this crisis, right? So, I mean, I recently read an article that claims turning off your computer camera video during a chat could save or reduce emissions by 96%. Now, I don't know whether or not that's true or false, and I'm not suggesting that we turn off our cameras to create a different social problem. What I am suggesting is that we consider the trade-offs when developing these new solutions, right? And leveraging policy to advocate for fair objectives to enable these technologies to come to market in an inclusive of environmental justice communities is going to be paramount. We can only do so much in, again, as I mentioned, helping the non-believers believe in what we're faced with. So creating that business case for them, making it attractive enough for them to move forward, right? And we still reap the environmental benefits on the back end.
Thank you. Well, thank you all so much. I really appreciate your time. And thank you to everyone who was watching online for the questions that you submitted. They were great. I tried to get to, I think, most of them. But thank you again for joining us. And I hope that you can join the next event for your future event, which will be on Thursday, March 11th at the same time. And it's called Game Time Decision Making in Times of Disruption. So thank you again and good night.
Thank you,
you.
guys.
Thank you.
Take care.
Bye, everybody.